Hello, everyone. I'm Graham Mann, and welcome to the Starting Stories podcast. On this podcast, we interview entrepreneurs, creatives, investors, and more to find out how they got started and the habits and learnings that made them successful so you can apply it to your own life. Hello, everyone. Today's guest is Rob Barbara, who is currently a managing partner at Build Ventures in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is a venture capital firm focused on emerging companies based in Atlantic Canada. Rob studied economics at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and did his MBA at the Ivey Business School at the University of Western Ontario before working in investment banking at TD Securities. He followed that by founding a startup in the medical space during the dot-com boom, then doing investment management at Burgundy Asset Management, where he founded an internal startup called Beaujolais Private Investment Management before moving back to Nova Scotia and starting Build Ventures. I know Rob primarily through sailing, which he's pursued competitively for most of his life. And in this episode, we cover his decision-making process through university and his career, why he didn't enjoy investment banking, how his startup went, and the thesis behind Build Ventures, among other things. I have yet to have a conversation with Rob that isn't entertaining, and this one was no exception. We had a couple technical difficulties to begin with, but things really get rolling after that. Don't forget to check out the show notes with links to things we talk about at grahammann.net/podcast. But otherwise, please enjoy this chat with Rob Barbara. Thanks for being here today, Rob.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking me to be here today.
So before we get into your professional background and so on, we both know each other through sailing, which you've been heavily involved in for some time. But how did you originally get into sailing? Off the bat, we had a few technical difficulties, but basically Rob said he grew up in Montreal until about age 12 when they moved to Halifax, and he made friends with someone who had a laser dinghy, which is a small sailboat.
And the first May that I was here, my friend took out his laser, and I just simply asked him if I could jump on it, and he sort of looked at me like, have you ever sailed before? And I was too stupid to know that I might have been better off having had a lesson before I jumped on a laser, but nonetheless, I went on, and it was immediate. It's, there's those moments in time where, somebody meets a moment, an obvious moment where things fit perfectly, and that was one of them for me. I'd been an okay athlete my whole life, but the minute I jumped on a boat, it was an immediate, both an immediate love and in hindsight, an immediate, indication that there was a natural aptitude towards it because I was able to, without any lesson, jump on this boat and get around pretty proficiently. And I've never looked back. It just, was the only thing. I generally enjoy sports, but that was the one sport that I just couldn't get enough of. And, my parents never needed to do anything to motivate me to go. And it was just, it was the first indication. And, that's certainly a theme that I used for the rest of my life where, the signs were clear that this is something I should do.
Right.
So, and at 50 years old, which I am now, I'm still active in it. And I think that's one of the great things about the sport as well.
And what do you find so appealing with it that keeps you coming back? Like, is it just that moment, or you've identified specific things now that you find appeal to you?
Yeah, no, there's probably, I tend to keep my list to 3. That's a personal habit that I've developed. So the 3 main reasons I come back to it is I absolutely love the ocean. And that's something, I've been, privileged to grow up in Nova Scotia and live in Nova Scotia to have access to. And I just, it's one of those things, no matter what I'm doing, if I'm just jumping on a boat to get somewhere, or if I'm, going boarding or going sailing, anything, literally any physical opportunity to be on the ocean, there's a noticeable difference in my being, whether it's both physical and emotional. Mm-hmm. It's quite striking how clear and obvious that love of the ocean is. I love the sensation of sailing. I really, really just everything about just moving a boat through the water using wind is something I really enjoy. And the competition, it's funny. It was later on in life that I understood the complexity of that competition and how it actually fits with my vocation. Sailing is not just a a sport that requires physical attributes, and you have to be good at the physical aspects of maneuvering a boat and doing the things that you have to do on a boat. But the mental side of the sport is very actually consistent with the challenges in investing and the amount of time you have to spend dealing with uncontrollable variables, and how your focus on process, I believe, is critical in terms of your success, both in sailing and in investing, because of that aspect of the uncontrollable variables that are they're inherent in both. So I love that kind of competition. I just find it challenging and enjoyable. I said I was going to keep the list of three. The fourth one that I've really started to appreciate. The fourth one that I really appreciate as I've gotten older, though, is the team aspect of it, and I really enjoy sailing with a group of people, and the enjoyment of working with those people, and then the relationships that are just so strong because of it. I've luckily sailed generally with the same group of people for the past 17-ish years, and they're the closest things I have to brothers and sisters, other than my actual sister.
Okay, so there's two things there. Similar to your vacation or similar to investment, you touched on it. I mean, there's unknowable variables, or at least a lot of unknown variables in both investing and sailing. But more specifically, I guess, how does success or failure in sailing or an investment correlate with the other?
In both sports, you have to have a strong understanding and acceptance of how both luck and skill affect an outcome. And you have to accept the role of luck, acknowledge it, accept it, and credit it, which is inherently counter, I think, to how humans would prefer the world would work. Humans would prefer to know that their actions are to, control all outcomes. Mm-hmm. Humans prefer to know how and why things happen, and would be able to explain and understand an outcome in terms of specific ingredients that went into it. But in both sailing and investing, luck plays a major role, and you have to accept that. And that's so hard for so many humans to do, but it's something that I've learned to do, and I think it gives me an inherent advantage. Mm-hmm. I like to tell people never mistake luck for skill. It's one of the most dangerous things you can do. Mm-hmm. And I almost take it. I think my personal method in which I push myself to never forget that rule is to actually overcompensate. So I'm very likely to credit luck for, even if it was skill. And I'm on a boat and in investing, I'm constantly banking, things that I think were out of my control, but may not have been as out of my control as I might have first appreciated. But to be able to maximize the positive outcomes in a complex system in which skill and luck both play a big role is to have sound process and to follow that process and to be disciplined around that process. And my natural personality, I mean, it's it's an interesting thing for a lot of people to hear, for those that know me, and my outward personality, which is my true personality, but it tends to be a little, gregarious and tendency towards maybe a little bit of mischief and stuff like that. Is I'm inherently a very disciplined person. Okay. And especially around decision making. And I've just, I think, recognizing that both sailing and investing, you can benefit from that disciplined investment making skill. I think it's just, I think that's the way the world works. I've been naturally attracted to both of them.
So you mentioned discipline and good process as things that are necessary to be successful in each, but are these things that you can develop as skills, or do you think they're more tied to inherent character traits?
No, you can absolutely develop them. You can absolutely develop them. I think some people are just going to struggle. Some people's personalities just preclude them from ever getting good at them, and that's just an unfortunate reality of the cards that they've been dealt genetically. But I think within a large range, people can develop those skills. Some are going to be better than others at it, but you can develop those skills. And I think part of that developing the skills is first, understand what a process is, and understand what you have to do to follow a process. But then secondly, which is sort of the learning aspect of this, is having the success around following your process and building the conviction around your process, and takes you to the next level.
Right.
I think that's an important aspect of it. No process is perfect. And to think you can find a perfect process is neurotic. But good processes followed in a disciplined manner will mostly, will yield good outcomes more often than not. It's that conviction that you have a good process that you have to develop over time. And so you need to be patient. You need to have the kind of the mind that can understand the testing that you're doing around your process and all that kind of stuff, and do that in a manner that allows you to build that conviction.
And how would one start, or where would one start to either learn about developing those processes, or how to do that? Or what's an example?
In both sailing and investing, there's many that have gone before us that have done it very, very well. So I think that's the best place to start, is to start reading. In investing, where I've done more reading, it's funny. I've done more of the reading in investing than I finally, in that, realized how it applied to sailing.
Right.
But I tended to find myself drawn to people that are described as value investors. I think part of the reason, because their process is so fundamentally sound and very understandable, because it's often at a micro level, understanding companies, which I think you can understand. You're more likely to gain a strong understanding. So I read a lot about Ben Graham, Warren Buffett, Peter Lynch, those kind of investors. Charlie Munger. Right. And it just resonated with me. So for me, I don't know if this is fair for anybody, but it resonated initially for me. So I didn't spend a lot of time looking at other core processes, other people's processes. But my own process sort of developed out of there. And, clearly it's clearly a derivative of that kind of investment. I think the thing that I've done that's unique is, my previous experience in public markets, there's a more obvious connection between the kind of investing that those people did in public markets investing. I've overtly tried to apply those kind of processes, those public market value-based processes, to venture capital, which I think is clearly more unique. And time will tell. I don't know yet. Time will tell me if it worked at some point, but I've got a sense that it is going to benefit Build Ventures.
Okay. That's interesting. We'll circle back to that when we talk about Build, maybe. The other thing I wanted to ask, you mentioned this rule of 3 that you have. Where else do you apply that?
That's a good question. I just have a habit
rule of 4, as it is.
This question, whenever I'm answering a question about what is it about this that you like, my brain just goes to 3. And I think that also is a suggestion to my personality. So I'm not answering your question, but I think this is still interesting. I think you can cover most of the reasoning around 3 points. And certainly there may be more points, but their impact on an outcome is probably starting to be diluted. And so why bother spending too much time on them? I think most people, from a communications perspective, I think most people can handle up to 3 things before messages start getting both muddled or even lost. That's why I think I've tended to get around. So it's mostly a communications thing rather than a analytical thing or a process thing that I talk around these 3 factors a lot.
Right. It's almost like a rule of thumb proxy for like an application of the 80-20 principle or something.
That's a good description. Yeah. I might use that in the future. I hope that's okay.
Oh, go for it. Yeah. Okay. So shifting gears a little bit, we'll go back to your university days. You studied economics at Queen's.
Yes.
In Kingston. Why economics and why Queen's?
All right. Well, I promise to be very transparent with you, even if some of these stories might, in hindsight, look a little questionable. Why Queens? So, another insight into my personality is one where initially not thoughtfully, but then later I understood that it was perhaps more thoughtful and made more sense to me. I've always sort of optimized around an equation whereby one must achieve, but you should also have a lot of fun at the same time.
Right.
The constraint would be the level of achievement. I always sort of, I remember at Queens, I started becoming thoughtful about it at Queens. I had a sort of a minimum GPA I knew I had to achieve. And I literally thought after that anything else was me not allocating enough time to fun.
Right.
So Queens I knew I wanted to go to a good university. I'd had a strong high school education. I was lucky to grow up with peers that wanted to achieve as well, which I think is an important factor for people to grow up with the right peer group. And I knew Queens was, at the time considered one of the better schools in Canada, but I applied to McGill, Queens, U of T, Mount Allison. I think that's most of them. But literally one morning in the fall, there was a front page paper. I think it was the Globe and Mail, but I can't absolutely confirm that. Story about Queens students having way too much fun at a Queens McGill football game. I thought that school, that was an illustration of exactly what I think my mantra was, achieve, but have a lot of fun at the same time. So this was clearly, these kids are very smart. They're going to a very good school, but man, are they ever having a good time at the same time. So that's why I decided I wanted to go to Queens. The story gets even more immature about why I actually went to Queens thinking I was going to do sciences and decided that the science schedule was too onerous for a first-year student who wanted to have fun. So I decided to switch into arts, where I would only have to go to class 15 hours a week instead of 35 hours a week. It was literally that immature of a decision. I took almost like a liberal arts curriculum. I took calculus, economics, political science, a couple of business courses. Anyway, 5 credits sort of spread out, no focus. And the only A I got was economics. So I decided that there was a signal in that and I might as well do economics. That's how I ended up doing economics. I stuck around for a master's degree, which seems a bit ridiculous for somebody who wasn't clearly that committed to the science. But that's because one day when a friend of mine was he and I were going to go grab some lunch in 4th year, and he decided to go by the grad school office to get an application. I picked one up at the same time. It wasn't an onerous application, so I submitted it and got a letter back a couple weeks later saying not only was I accepted into a master's degree, but they were going to give me $15,000 to do it. So suddenly I'm a master's student. I'm a master's candidate at Queens in economics. It's like this is a theme. The 20s are difficult, but it doesn't. I think in hindsight, this is something that benefited me, but at the time, there was just no thought going into anything. It was just literally, I knew in the back of my mind that continuing to be educated and getting more education and a quality education was never going to hurt me. I was 21 years old at the time. I was in no rush. That's sort of how that all played out. I'd love to tell you that it was some grand scheme, but it wasn't.
Yeah, although, I don't think any of us really have a grand scheme, but I mean, the part that strikes me is it sounds like those were early hedges that you made, basically, or other applications of like an 80-20. So optionality or hedging or however you want to describe it. Yes, that's something I've always understood. Yeah. It's like I'm going to go to a good school and going to keep this minimum GPA, which will therefore not limit my options.
Absolutely. And it's something I still do today. And it's something that, even at Build Ventures, which I know we're going to talk about later, is a consistent thought process that both my partner and I think about when we're making decisions.
Right.
This concept of always don't ever eliminate a free option.
Right.
And once you understand capital markets, you understand the value of an option. And once you understand that, you're more likely to recognize and not eliminate these options when they come up. And that, that's the second time now you've given me a description of something I might have done that I'm going to use in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hopefully I can contribute something to this discussion. So the other interesting point that you made there that I want to touch on is you mentioned you were lucky to grow up with a peer group who was equally ambitious, and that was important. So, I mean, two things. Does it just apply when you're growing up or during those early formative years? One. And then two, which you may have some insight on now, but probably wouldn't have back then as a parent, how do you try and ensure that your kids grow up with a peer group who's ambitious or a positive influence on them?
Very good questions. I spend a lot of time thinking about both, actually. The answer to your first question is simple. It always matters. The people you spend time with are going to have a big influence on your life. I think, especially for an extrovert like me, I think they have a big impact, and you're always going to be better off exposing yourself to people who, have better outlooks, more positive outlooks, are contributing, are motivated, are ambitious, are all the things that I think help improve one's quality of life.
Why do you think it matters more for an introvert or an extrovert? Sorry.
So I've always, this is an area in which I'm not an expert, but I draw a lot of energy from other people. Mm-hmm. So source of my energy is other people.
Right.
And so I think I'm always naturally more sensitive to what others are doing. And so there's a chance of me spending more time with people that are positively energizing me versus people that don't. And I know when I have to deal with negative people, mm-hmm. I don't, I've gotten much better as I've matured to be able to just brush them off. Mm-hmm. But that's a learned behavior. Negative people do affect me and have a tendency not to just walk the other way and ignore them. I've gotten much better at that. And it's something I'm also trying to teach my kids now that I think I've gotten better at it. In terms of your kids, there's certain things you can do if you have the resources. So I think I send my kids to a great school. It's a private school. They're surrounded by kids from households where parents also care about the education and what their kids end up doing. Parent engagement is, I believe, I'm not an expert in this, but I've read this before. Parent engagement is one of the leading indicators in terms of positive outcomes for kids. Mm-hmm. Despite the negative, some of the negative stuff about helicopter parenting, I think there's a fine line. But I think an engaged parent is a good parent. So my kids go to a school full of engaged parents. Kids that are from households where being ambitious is something that is valued. Doing good things, contributing, all that kind of stuff is valued. I also like the fact that my school that my kids go to also provide a lot of financial assistance, so they're also surrounded by kids that are motivated for the other reason. They come from households where there isn't a lot, and there's some self-motivation based on that. I'm always encouraging my kids. I try to do it as subtly as possible, but when I see my kids hanging around with the right kids, I try to make a point of it. I like that kid. That's a good kid. What's this kid doing? And when the opposite happens, which does happen from time to time, I certainly, I don't come out and overtly tell them that I don't think they should be hanging around with somebody, but I certainly am, less encouraging about their relationships as such.
Right.
So I think I really do think that if I'm lucky that my three sons end up with the right friends and the right peers, and that's going to have so much impact on them, along with the right family and perhaps going to the right school. I think that's, again, three factors, probably maybe even the most important indicator of their future success, that they grow up with the right peer group.
Yeah. Okay, we're getting off on lots of tangents here, but I find them too interesting to pass up. So, two things. You mentioned you're getting better at brushing off negative people and trying to teach that. So, yeah. How have you gotten better, or how do you do that now? And then I think the distinction between an engaged parent and a helicopter parent is something fairly interesting as well. So how do you make the distinction there, or how do you try and make sure you're engaged but not helicopter?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's tough. Let me answer the first one first. As I've gotten older, I've far more appreciated the value of my time and energy. And I've overtly understood that applying that time and energy I have to allocate that time and energy efficiently, and allocating it to negative situations, especially ones in which I can't control, is useless.
Mm-hmm.
So it's learned. It's an understood behavior based on realization that you've got a finite resource, time and energy, and you got to allocate it. Rationally. As you get busier and busier, you have a family, you have a career, and all the stuff that makes you busy, you're more likely to understand the value of your time and energy. So I think that's how I've learned that. I think that's been the biggest factor for me, learning that skill. Helicopter parenting versus engaged parenting. I do not know the answer to this one, Graham. Everybody has their own experience. I know absolutely that. So in terms of my own situation, I'm pretty confident my wife and I are engaged. I know my wife and I are cognizant of not being helicopter parents. Are we doing a good job of it? I really don't know. Time will tell. The one thing that both my wife and I, though, do recognize, and we work hard to try to protect against, and perhaps this is one of the key attributes that distinguish between just engaged and being a helicopter parent, is that kids only learn through experience. And if you protect them from negative experience, or you do everything for them so they don't gain those experiences, they're just not going to learn. Mm-hmm. So, simple example, but one that happens so frequently in our house. Kid forgets his lunch. Clearly, it'd be easy for one of us to jump in the car and bring the lunch to school. Now, whether the fact that we don't do that, does that make us not a helicopter parent? I don't know. But we just won't do that. We decide that these kids are just going to keep forgetting their lunch if we keep driving it to school for them.
Right.
So what's the word? And we also, obviously there's a recognition that the risk is limited. Like, what's the risk of a kid not having a lunch at school? Comes home really hungry, and maybe he wasn't as sharp as he could be that afternoon at school.
Right.
Not a big cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
The cost of always doing stuff for kids and bailing them out all the time is massive.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that we do recognize, and we try to allow our kids to learn through experience, and we are certainly, I am far more comfortable perhaps than my wife is. That's, I think, just the reality of fathers with 3 sons and mothers with 3 sons. I have no problem letting them have these negative experiences. My wife, has to talk herself into it more than I do.
Right. It's just another cost-benefit analysis there. But
yes.
I think to some extent, I don't know what the answer is either, though I find it fascinating. But I think one aspect certainly is just being cognizant of the fact that there is a distinction somewhere between the two. That in itself, I think, is probably valuable. And then certainly the learning through experience, I think, is totally true. Just to jump back to the negative people and experiences.
Yeah.
Specifically, like what's an example on how you eliminate, if you realize someone is a negative influence, or this event or obligation is a negative influence, how do you, do you just eliminate it, or like specifically how have you gotten better at saying no to things or reducing that from your schedule?
Well, so, okay, that question, I didn't know that's where you're going, but that's an interesting question. Again, there's a lot of benefits of getting old. There's a lot of benefits. There's a lot of negatives, but there's a lot of benefits. I am very confident that I have contributed, that I've generally tried to be as good of a person as I can. I believe
I act with integrity, and I know I'm painfully transparent and almost to a fault. I know my intentions are sound and good and sound. So I've developed this confidence with me as a person that I'm very comfortable with. And once you've got that comfort level, it's a lot easier to disappoint people because you know inherently this is, at the end of the day, the ledger on you as a person is still positive.
Right.
That's something, again, I think that's something that comes with time as you get more and more confident in who you are and that you're generally, if you take criticism, it's mostly unfair. Mm-hmm. It's perhaps short-sighted. Not that we're all, by no means are we perfect. I mean, we do bad things all the time, or I shouldn't say bad things, that's the wrong word, but we do things imperfectly all the time. But you got to look at things in a holistic manner and look at the person holistically and accept their faults but recognize on balance, that they're a positive force in the world and they're trying to be on the good guys team. I have that confidence today, more so than I did 20 years ago. Right. And so, I'm very comfortable just knowing I can say no to somebody when I'm saying no for a couple of reasons, right? I'm saying no either because I don't agree with what they're trying to do. And I can often, if I need to, I can articulate why I think that's the case. And it tends to be consistent with, my value set or, my objectives. Not that I don't help people do things that I have no intent, you help people all the time. So this is sort of, I'm looking at this differently than that. Or you just don't have the time, right? And that's another thing that happens when you have a family and you have 3 kids is you got to be a lot more selfish with your time, but you at least know that it's because you're directing it towards your family and you got to be confident making those trade-offs.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes sense. Okay. We'll circle back here. You did your master's in economics and then I'm not totally sure here, but did you work for Fisheries and Oceans afterwards?
Yeah. So it was September of 1990. This is a fun story, so I'll tell you it in some. I felt like I deserved the vacation of a lifetime. I had just gone to school for 8 years. I'd written 2 theses. I wrote an undergrad thesis and a master's thesis. I just felt, again, being so immature at the time, that I deserved just to put up my feet and hang back. So I came back to Nova Scotia. Without even asking, I moved back in with my parents. Sound familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I immediately, so September of 2000, I immediately started sailing every day and then going out at night, having the time of my life. And 6 weeks into that time of my life, and literally 6 weeks, in hindsight, my dad gave me a long vacation. He basically just came to my room one morning and said, "Hey, this is done." And he did one of the smartest things he's ever done, and for something for which I'm still grateful. He basically booted me out of the house. I can't tell you how awesome that was. I needed a kick in the butt. He gave me a kick in the butt. So I had to go get a job because I was broke. I had no money. I was on beyond fumes. So this is I love telling the story because I think it does. I am very proud of this aspect of who I am. I started going to headhunters, and I know the listeners don't know what I look like, but Graham does. I don't look old, and so at 50, I don't look 50, and I'm very proud. I'm very happy about that. Now that but at 22 years old, I look 17. Right, I look really young. So I went to these headhunters, and all these people were scratching their head about why this 17-year-old kid was coming in looking for jobs. And one of them actually sat me in front of a computer to take a typing test. It was a temp agency. I didn't realize that at the time. So I took the typing test, and I'm a 5-finger typer, but I was able to type 42 words a minute, and the minimum was 40. So the person started talking to me going, what kind of work do you want? I go, well, I've got a master's degree in economics, and their jaw just dropped to the ground. It's going, what? I says, yeah, here I'm looking for a job. And they go, well, you don't really have those kind of jobs, but we do temp work. And I said at the time, I'm broke. I need to make something. So what kind of temp work is there? And typically a lot of it was, traditional EA type jobs, which I wasn't probably either suited or interested in. But I was willing to do anything. And I told them that. I go, listen, I don't mind work. So there's something that makes sense for a guy like me. I'm happy to do it. And a job did come up at DFO. They needed somebody to set up a new division, an enforcement division. And it literally was, crap work of running around. It was just pure labor. And so I took it. And I met this guy there that I got along with, and I saw a posting for an economist, and I asked him about it one day. I go, how does one apply for this? And he goes, well, it's an internal posting, and I'm not sure you're internal because I was sort of a temp. I was being paid by the temp agency, and I wasn't actually an employee of DFO. And he kind of looked at me, he goes, but you actually need to be an economist to do this job. And I was doing, like I said, crap work at this point. So I told the guy I had a master's degree in economics. His jaw hit the ground going, this kid with a master's degree is doing all this shitty work. But I think that impressed him about my personality, that I was willing to do the stuff like that. So he helped get me the job. And suddenly I'm an economist at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which was a great moment in my life. Because in your 20s, when you are so likely to you really don't know where you're going, and you need the system, to help point you in the right direction. Working at DFO was one of the worst experiences of my life. The only reason I lasted as long as I did is because I was also competitively sailing at the time. And it was actually the perfect job for a competitive sailor because it paid me well, especially for the age I was. And the hours were, you did have a certain amount of, you had to be there at a certain time. You couldn't leave to a certain time. But they had all these programs where you could put in more time Monday to Thursday and get every Friday off and all this other stuff that allowed you the flexibility that you needed to be able to focus on sailing. And I actually had a great couple of years where I was actually part of a team that won back-to-back national J24 championships. So I achieved so much in sailing while doing this terrible job, but that wore thin very quickly. And it actually, and to be, I don't mind being a bit overly transparent, as I told you I am. I mean, I think I got depressed working at DFO. Like, it got ugly for a while. Like, this was meaningless, boring, uninspiring work. Now,
what was your day-to-day like as an economist? Like, what were you doing?
Like, I still can't describe to you what I was supposed to be doing. Right? Papers on policy. I was researching outcomes on policy. At the time, they just implemented a new fishery collective individual quota system. And I was trying to collect data to see whether that, the intended consequences of the new system were indeed occurring. But man, like, it was bad. It was really bad. Not motivated at all. And so, that was the first thing that happened, where I sort of, in my 20s, first my dad kicks me out of the house, which is a good first kick in the butt. And then this job that is literally making me sick, it's so boring and so uninspiring, was the next big kick in my butt that said, listen, like, you got to start thinking about what you want to do with your life, because you got to use this mind in a productive manner that you enjoy, because otherwise this is going to be a miserable, your time on this planet is going to be miserable. So I did what I did, which at the time seemed like the rational thing to do, and I think it was go back to school, back to this, go back and get a good education, but this time go back thoughtfully trying to figure out what you want to do with your time. And I went and did an MBA at the University of Western Ontario. And then that's the second thing, just like when I stepped on that sailboat when I was 13 and it went, there's almost like angels came out from heaven and started singing. It was such a perfect moment. I went to my MBA and started focusing on finance, and a similar thing occurred. Like, it was just, this is great. I enjoyed this. This is fun. I connected with the professor. I became his TA. Today, he's still a good friend of mine. I excelled in school. I was on the dean's list. It was just, again, this, finally, I saw it in a, not a sport. Now this is more of, what your career is going to be, how fun and easy it is, and how good you are when you're doing something you enjoy.
Right.
That was a huge lesson. I mean, I'm still blessed. I still feel very privileged that I was taught that lesson. And it has guided me ever since. I mean, this concept of do what you enjoy, a lot of people pay it lip service. A lot of people say it. I've experienced it, and I can't emphasize that enough, how important it is.
Right.
So that's how I ended up in first finance. I went and did some investment banking, which was, that didn't work for me. The environment in investment banking is one that didn't fit my personality. I then tried to be an entrepreneur. I started a company with a friend, which was fantastic. And there I learned, another big lesson that has guided me in my life. I like being my own boss. So Steve Cord and I founded a company. I learned more in those 16 months than I've ever learned in my life. It wasn't financially successful, but it was a great experience. And then I ended up in investing. I mean, at that point in my life, I got married, started having kids, realized that, I can't be that irresponsible with what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. I actually now have to start providing for a family. So I got a job in investing, which I always knew was something I should do. I'd done my CFA at the same time, concurrently with working. So this continual focus on finance and investing was clear. I ended up at a company called Burgundy, which was great, but I excelled at Burgundy when I was allowed to pursue an idea I had and start a company inside a company. So again, this entrepreneurial side. And even though I had a boss at Burgundy, I acted like I didn't have a boss. I took my new company and I built it and ran it. And I came up with some of my I've got some important management messages that I like to give people, because I really enjoy working with high performance people. And I think I've really learned about what motivates high performance people. Mm-hmm. I think I've learned it. I've read a bit, and there's a couple of books have been helpful, but I've also just been intuitive to know what motivates me. And I've sort of used that model in terms of motivating other people. And so, some of the things I love to encourage people to do is to take risks, to do what you think is right, to have reasons why you do things. If you have reasons about why you do things and you don't have to ask for permission, if you don't ask for permission and something doesn't go well, that's fine, because you can, it's easier to beg for forgiveness than to ask for permission anyways. And all I expect as a boss is that if something doesn't turn out well, that's fine. Just don't do it again. Learn from it and don't do it again. So I had this great opportunity to build this company inside a company. Again, another entrepreneurial opportunity. And it just another moment where I was just doing something that was so clearly in my wheelhouse. Such a round peg in a round hole is another model I like to, or another descriptor I like to use. I'm a big believer that you should put round pegs in round holes and square pegs in square holes, and don't try and jam square pegs in round holes. It worked out really, really well for me. And then it laid the groundwork for me to come home to Halifax and pursue venture investing, which is I believe it's a combination of my entrepreneurial side and my investing background, both of which I enjoyed tremendously.
Right. Okay. I want to dig into a few things on each of those, but why did investment banking after your MBA not work, or what differentiated it from the later investment work that you did with Burgundy? Because you liked one and didn't like the other.
Yeah. So, and I'm gonna answer those two questions, but I'm gonna give you another story because it fits with something you said earlier. Why did I go into investment banking? I went into investment banking because when you're in an MBA program, there's two jobs that everybody seeks that have perceived more value than any other job. That's being an investment banker or being a management consultant.
Right.
I realized that I might as well apply for these jobs, because then I'd have the option. Back to that option, clear understanding of, keep giving yourself options, that if I got one of the jobs, I could at least try it and maybe it's great. And maybe I'll then have one of these highly sought after jobs that have great value. That's the only reason I went into investment banking. So I got there, and investment banking is any investment bankers listening to this podcast might get angry at some of the stuff I'm going to say, but this is only what I believe. It's purposeless work. It is a tax on the system that creates unnecessary steps and creates inefficiency in a system. There are certainly things that they have to do that the system can't do, maybe organize buyers around securities or sellers around securities and stuff like that. But for the most part, investment bankers create unnecessary transactions. And when I asked why we were creating these transactions, the only answer I could ever get is so we could make a big fee. Right. So purpose, I never found purpose in the work. And I think finding purpose in the work is important. I can't be motivated otherwise. That's just my personality. Mm-hmm. I really struggled. Second thing about investment banking that really didn't fit with my personality was the culture. And it is indeed exactly the culture that's often portrayed in movies and television. It's greedy, cutthroat, backstabbing. It's just not my scene. It really isn't my scene. So I stuck around long enough to confirm all that. And I was lucky to work at a bank that allowed me to try a bunch of different things. So I worked in investment banking, equity derivatives, debt derivatives, a couple of different areas. And so certainly long enough to confidently conclude that this was not my calling in life.
Right.
And I think that's the key. So, investment banking is a transactional business. Investment management is not. I mean, you do make transactions, but you're a steward and a manager of wealth. So you're not constantly out there trying to create unnecessary transactions to pad your own pocket. In fact, good investment managers try to minimize the number of transactions because they tend to be frictional in nature and detract from wealth creation. I also found purpose. We were managing money at Burgundy. We were managing money for both individuals and for institutions. On the individual side, I was able to convince myself, and I think this wasn't contrived. I think this is indeed true, that we were saving a lot of people from really bad investment experiences. Mm-hmm. And I found a lot of purpose in that, almost like a money superhero role, protecting people from evil. On the institutional side, we got a lot of positive. We had a lot of, especially on the charitable side, many foundations were very happy with us in terms of the amount of work they were able to do because of the quality of the investment management that they were receiving from my firm. We once had one foundation that went through some very hard times credit my firm for saving it because the foundation was so financially healthy and they were able to draw on the resources of the foundation. So there is a lot of purpose. You can really find a lot of purpose if you're at the right place, and I was at the right place, and that motivated me. That every day that was motivating for me. I used it to motivate the staff. We were there. I was there in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis when it was really, really ugly, and me and my team had to, we really had to protect the clients. And I motivated the team by saying, this is our moment. This is when we have to step up and really help people. This is when we can be very useful. And all that purpose-based motivation, I think, really, really helped and really motivated people to do their jobs as well as they could. So you can find purpose. At least I can find purpose in investment management. I couldn't find it in investment banking.
Right. It sounds like there's much more of a synergy between the value-based investment theories and processes that you liked or had found interesting in the investment management versus investment banking.
Yeah.
So I want to touch on the startup in the middle of there too. It was called eSalvio.
Yeah. So they started.
It was in the medical space, right?
It was. It wasn't my idea. I had a very good friend, Steve Cord, a doc, who found a problem inside his own practice at least in Canada, but also in a different way, globally. Patients were being generally guided into doctors' offices unnecessarily to get things that you didn't need to be in a doctor's office for. The reason for that differed in jurisdictions. In Canada is because Medicare only paid doctors if they saw patients face to face. But that there are provisions in the Canada Health Act that doctors could theoretically charge patients for
things that aren't covered under provincial health coverage. But doctors obviously aren't tooled to be able to do that kind of stuff. So it was a simple idea. It was just both a web and a phone-based system by which patients could connect with their doctors around things like simple advice, prescription renewals, filling out forms that they often need for insurance and stuff like that in a much more convenient manner. But that ultimately the patient paid the doctor for the service. Not huge amounts, $15 here and stuff like that. So what we built was the marketplace platform in which the two sides could transact. And I'll tell you, we had huge demand from patients. Oh my God, the patient demand was off the charts. But even though we were successful in getting, our initial 300 doctors on our system, I think I'd rather sit on my front porch and hit myself repeatedly over the head with a 2x4 than ever try and change doctor behavior again.
So you're not rushing back into the medical space then?
No, and in fact, it's, these biases that you have to protect yourself against and from investment decision making. This is one that I fight all the time, because if we have a startup come in to build ventures that's, that's geared towards hospital efficiency or healthcare management or something that has to do with operational and behavioral change inside medicine, I have an immediate, I tend to have an immediate negative reaction that I have to counter. Because of the experience. It's really hard. I mean, it's a tough business. I understand much. I'm a lot more sympathetic now about why it's hard to change. I've had, time has given me the opportunity to understand more why it's hard to get doctors to change their way despite an economic incentive. But it's a tough nut.
Right.
It's a very tough nut.
So how did tell me a little bit about the founding process of that company and why and how you agreed to join?
Again, this is, so you're going to love this. I thank you for having this. This has been, I hadn't really thought through all this, how this is going to love. Plus, another free option. I was done at TD Securities. I was done with investment banking. That was no longer an option for me. Coincidentally, at the same time, this buddy of mine has this idea and he kind of wants to get it off the ground. But as a doc, he had no background other than medicine. So it was just this one, and I still wasn't married. I didn't have kids. So I had this great opportunity to not worry about personal finances. I've always been a good saver. I'm a value guy, not just in investing, but in spending. So I had financial resources at the time to, hold me together for a while. And I just basically said, why not? Why wouldn't I do this?
Mm-hmm. Did you put money in?
Put a little bit of money in at the outset. Yeah, we were, I guess as a percentage of my net worth at the time, it was pretty high, but I think my partner and I both put in about 25 grand. Mm-hmm. But we were also,
it was just the two of you.
It was just the two of us, but we ended up being able to raise 750 grand pretty easily. It was the tech bubble. It was actually, I learned a lot of lessons again from this experience, but we were able to raise 750 grand pretty easily.
This was 2000 to 2001, which was sort of the period of of the company, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Now, the thing we were at the tail end, and right after we raised the 750, it was clear that the market was changing very, very fast. So we were lucky not to spend that 750 irrationally like a lot of people were doing back then. And we were able to let that 750 last for a long time. But yeah, we raised money. We had a product in the market. We got quite a ways before we ran out of money. And by the time we ran out of money, I mean, the whole tech meltdown had occurred.
Right.
We weren't raising a penny from anybody. It was done.
And so did you get acquired or you shut it down?
No, we got acquired, but for paper in another startup that subsequently failed.
Right. And at the time, I mean, the process towards the end of it, when you did get acquired, you knew the end was coming. You were kind of running out of money.
We were running out of money. That's, something else happened. Even though I lost $750,000 of other people's money, I never got credit. My partner and I never got criticized once. Those people saw us. We did everything we could, and they saw that we were doing everything we could. We didn't take a salary. We didn't waste their money.
worked our asses off. We had success. I hate to say this because this is so shallow, but we were on CNN at one point. So, it didn't save the company being on CNN, but man, those people that put in $750,000 certainly had some overt indication that we weren't sitting back doing nothing.
Right.
And so I learned a lesson there too. It's, it's how it's again, your process. You follow a strong process and you execute and you behave the right way, you can survive negative outcomes. And in fact, I would say our reputation was enhanced in that experience rather than we didn't take a reputational hit. We actually probably got an opportunity to enhance our reputation amongst those people.
Right. And these were mostly angel investors or actual VC firms?
No, we had one small VC firm that put in about $100,000. Other than that, it was all angels.
Okay.
There was a lot of angels. I forget what the number was, but it wasn't a small number of people either. It was we had a healthy number of people. A lot of $10,000 checks.
Oh wow! Yeah. Takes a lot of $10,000 checks to get $750. Okay. Back to Burgundy. So you started there doing investment management, and eventually you, as you mentioned, sort of founded within the company Beaujolais.
Yeah, Beaujolais. I spent a lot for that name.
You spent a lot for that name.
That's facetious. One night.
Does that translate to something?
So the genesis of Beaujolais was Burgundy had offsites, and at the offsites, they like to open up the floor to blue sky ideas from anybody at the company.
Okay.
There was a little bit of a sub understanding that you better come up with an idea. So I was sitting there trying to
quote voluntary idea period.
Yeah. So I was sitting there trying to come up with an idea, and I came up with the idea of a sister company called Beaujolais that dealt directly with two of the constraints that Burgundy rationally acknowledged that most investment firms don't acknowledge, that precluded them from taking. Burgundy's minimum investment at the time was $3 million, which was very, that's highly exclusive in Canada. And yet the average age of the Burgundy client was really old. And, I shouldn't say those people were old, but from a business perspective, it was very clear that there was risk at the business, given that the average age of their client was in their 60s. Right. And that there needed to be a way to engage both the younger generation, which often would include the offspring of the Burgundy client. But the constraints at the time were, one, Burgundy rationally viewed themselves as not having unlimited investment management capacity, especially around the management of small cap stocks. They, very rare in the business, but they said, we can only take in so much money before we're going to screw up our returns. And then secondly, the Burgundy service model was really high touch and just not scalable. And so Beaujolais was a simple idea to address those two constraints. My only intention was to present it, come across like a thoughtful person, end my presentation, sit back down, and go back to researching equities. The chairman loved the idea so much that he asked me to start it. And again, it's sort of that, why wouldn't I do this, right? Here's another option for me to do something that could potentially be really, really impactful, really interesting, and really enjoyable. So I did it. Oh, by the way, the name Beaujolais, at the last minute when I was coming up with my presentation, I decided I should come up with a name for it. And I went online and looked up the wine region of Burgundy, which is what Burgundy is named after. And the wine region of Burgundy, I'm not a wine person. I don't really know a lot of this stuff, but there's 15 appellations inside the region, and I didn't recognize any of them but two, Chablis and Beaujolais, and I knew I didn't want to be Chablis.
Okay.
Hence the name, and apparently it's a brilliant name. I didn't appreciate it at the time, but Beaujolais is a young Burgundy.
Okay.
So there is a smart. Now, some of the skeptics say it's a cheap Burgundy, but
not
so
necessarily off base anyway.
Yeah.
So was this literally like a day? Like this was this company retreat, and you were expected to come up with an idea, or you'd been thinking about founding something for a while, or about this issue?
No, I knew I had to come up with an idea. I knew, so I thought about it for about a week.
Okay.
And I came up with this idea, and I addressed the constraints, and I packaged it up, and I had a offering, and I had ideas about how to manage it and all this kind of stuff. I had put some thought into it. And so it looked a bit more like a turnkey solution than it was. I mean, it looked like on paper, it looked like a bit of a turnkey solution. It wasn't. But the chairman of the firm loved the idea and asked me to start it. And I did. And today, Beaujolais is a very successful investment management division of Burgundy. Very successful.
There you go. And how long did you run Beaujolais?
Well, I ran it alone for 4 years, and the worst thing happened. This is what happened, and this was terrible at the time. We were having issues at the firm, and the chairman asked me to take over the Burgundy Private Client Group. And so at the end, I'd be running the whole private client business at Burgundy, which would include Beaujolais. And I didn't want to do it, but they sort of did one of these, and we need you to do it. And it changed everything for me. It really, one of the reasons I'm probably not at Burgundy today is because of that, because it just I was on my own at Beaujolais. Suddenly I'm part of the bigger firm. I've actually got to report to this guy on a more frequent basis. I no longer feel like my own boss. It went well. One of the things Beaujolais had been able to do was a bit of an incubator for new ideas and had brought new thinking, and a lot of it, I think they appreciated a lot of that, and so they wanted a lot of that to be applied to Burgundy. So I was able to have a big impact, but it just wasn't as much fun.
Right.
So I passed the reins to other people and moved home when Patrick was getting Build Ventures up and running, and never looked back. It's been the best move.
Okay, so are you time constrained, by the way? I want to be respectful of your time.
No, I'm good. Okay.
So that brings us to Build Ventures. So you came back home, and what made you want to get into venture capital?
I wanted to move home. I wanted to work with my friend. I love the idea of a small 2-person shop with none of the, complexities of a large organization. And I sort of recognized this marrying of my love for being an entrepreneur and my respect for entrepreneurs and my investment background. That does meet Matt. It's they sort of come together in venture capital.
I can see that.
A big motivation was moving home, and it was a great opportunity to work in the right environment with the right person.
So why did you want to move home?
Living in Toronto's tough. It's tough. It's not enjoyable. Lifestyle's pretty, good lifestyles are hard to come by. Back to your allocation of time and energy. A lot of your time and energy is wasted on getting places, on dealing with the complexities and the pace of a busy city.
Okay, so I'm curious about this because I've visited Toronto and I have lots of friends that live there now, but I've never lived there. And I haven't been super excited to try lately. But aside from, is the commute thing an issue that's specific to Toronto, or it's just a big city thing?
I don't know. I suspect it's a big city thing. So I just hadn't done that before. The only city I've ever done it in is in Toronto. Right. I really didn't like it. I did it for 17 years though, so it's not like I didn't give it.
So it wasn't necessarily things specific to Toronto that caused you to move. It was potentially just big city things, or was there specific things?
I bet a lot of them were probably big city things.
Okay. And then what made you want to come back to Halifax, aside from being a small city?
Well, it's home. It's home for me. It's on the ocean. A lot of good friends here. Opportunity to really get back into, my favorite hobby, sailing. I knew it was a great place to bring up kids. Much better, much more consistent upbringing than I appreciated. And my wife's from a smaller town as well. She's from St. Catharines, Ontario. Then growing up in Toronto. Mm-hmm. I think also there's a people here are real. Here's a criticism of Toronto that may be a big city criticism. I don't know. People here are real. There's a really strong set of values that are consistent with my values here. There's a love of community. There's a cooperation amongst people. These are all really strong and important messages and characteristics that I hope my kids develop to have a good life. That's not as obvious in Toronto. Toronto's much more of a individual-centric place. Far more money. Money's a very important factor in Toronto.
You need money to be able to do stuff, but it's also seen as a bit of I think people position themselves around wealth. I think that's something that, to the extent that there is some form of
an aspiration in itself.
Yeah, ranking system is, there's a bit of a ranking system around wealth. Wealth is very important in Toronto, and wealth is not important to me. I'm happy that I am financially stable, but it's not something that I would never identify myself using that as a characteristic. I think it's not part of my value set.
Not an end in itself.
Yeah, but I'm living in a place where it's an important factor. My kids are seeing it, and their friends are talking about it, and it worried me. It definitely worried me.
Okay, so Build Ventures, maybe just give a brief description of what venture capital is for those that aren't familiar, and then how, the theory behind Build Ventures and what you guys are about.
So venture capital, let's start at venture capital, then let's get into venture capital in Canada, and that will then help describe Build and what Build is. But venture capital is an asset class. It's a pool of capital that's derived from both individuals and institutions that are seeking the kinds of returns that are possible in venture capital, and basically those kinds of returns are high. Venture capital returns can be very high teens into the 20s. Because you're investing in companies that truly can be game-changing companies, very disruptive market, very disruptive in big markets, and as a result can be very, very profitable, very valuable companies. And in investing in those, you can make a lot of money, basically. There's a lot of risk, though, because at the stage you're investing is often before companies are truly established. A lot of these companies you don't even know are going to make it, because they're still developing products that may or may not be widely accepted by markets, may or may not be disrupted by another company that's developing something at the same time, or may or may not be run into the ground by a management team that ultimately can't handle the task of building a company. But it's an important part, I think, in society and in modern economies, because to the extent that there are new companies being formed, and I think a healthy system has new companies always being formed, it's these companies need capital to be able to develop, and this kind of money's got to come from a specialty source, from people and firms that understand the risks associated with investing in companies at this early stage. So that's venture capital. It's highly established in California. It's been around in California for 70 years. A lot of money's been made. A lot of very big firms in California that have invested in companies like Google and Oracle and Facebook, and companies that are today worth hundreds of billions of dollars. So that's venture capital. Economies around the world and governments around the world want to promote this kind of financing source because they want this new company formation. It's starting these kind of companies tend to attract smart people that make higher wages, that support bigger tax bases and support communities and societies much better. So governments are interested in developing these things. It is a tough asset class to get off the ground because of the risk. So Patrick and I, it's hard for Patrick and I to go to an individual and say, hey, give us your money, we're going to invest in venture capital. We're only on our first fund. They go, so how have you done in the past? And we're like, well, we don't know because we're only on our first fund. So what has to happen? That's a consistent problem in Canada. And so what has to happen in Canada is that governments have to, if they are motivated in this, they have to get directly involved. Now, governments can get involved in two ways. They can either be the venture capitalists themselves, or they can invest in companies like Build Ventures and be indirect investors in venture capital. And they've tried both. And today it's generally viewed that governments are ill-equipped to be direct investors. There's a whole bunch of specific constraints and issues that they face that a private sector manager like Build Ventures doesn't face. Mostly around the ability to say yes and no more efficiently. It's hard for government people to say no naturally. It's much easier for Patrick and I to say no. especially because our own money's in the fund too. So whenever we make an investment, we're literally writing a personal check at the same time, which gives us a lot of focus and a lot of alignment with our other investors and gives us much more conviction around saying yes and no appropriately. I think that would be one of the biggest reasons why governments supporting private sector managers makes more sense than them trying to do it directly. So 5 years ago, Build Ventures was established. The 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces all became investors in Build Ventures, as did the Business Development Bank of Canada and the Export Development Bank of Canada. But we also got 5 private individuals involved. And the total committed capital is $65 million. Over the last 5 years, we've used that money to invest in 14 companies. We haven't invested all the money, but we have a full portfolio. We still have money left over that's going to be used to support those 14 companies. We often have to invest multiple rounds in helping these companies develop. And we don't help all of them. Some of them we have to make the tough decision to say, kind of like my dad booted me out of the house 30 years ago. Tough love. Sorry, we're no longer supporting you. We just don't think that this is good allocation of our money and time resources. We're going to allocate it somewhere else. The first fund is fully invested, and we're in the middle of trying to raise the second fund. So we continue to invest in Atlantic Canadian early stage technology companies, which is what we do.
Mm-hmm. So there's a few things there, but first of all, I mean, Atlantic Canada is not historically known for its tech scene, I wouldn't say. So there have been some significant exits. Radian 6 and Q1 are probably some of the largest, and certainly they would have been some of the largest before you started Build.
Yeah.
But what made you optimistic about the tech sector in Atlantic Canada when you founded Build, or what makes you optimistic about it now?
So
assuming you are optimistic.
No, I am optimistic, and I was optimistic around so as an investor, you always have to develop an investment thesis that will guide, what the opportunity is. The Build Ventures investment thesis, which still applies today, was that because of those 2 companies and others that you mentioned, the catalyst had occurred in Atlantic Canada to start driving new company, at least on the people side, people coming up with ideas and starting new companies. So yes, a nascent tech sector, but one that was improving. And because of these successes that the community had seen, one that was being motivated to, more and more people were motivated to start companies. And so we were at the early stages of a growing and improving tech sector. And that's indeed what's happened. I'd say 5 years out, it's even stronger today than it was 5 years ago. So we had, not a traditionally strong tech market, but one that was developing and was going to get stronger. But the other side, which was what really made me excited, and this is consistent with my value investing background, the opportunities occur in areas where there's not too much liquidity. And Build Ventures is the only venture capitalist in town. So there's not a ton of money chasing these deals, screwing up the investment opportunity. Mm-hmm. We are literally afforded, and we have to take this privilege very responsibly, because we can't get too, we'll lose this opportunity if we become too greedy. But we're able to invest in companies at very fair terms, because there's literally, we're not chasing deals, we're not competing for deals. We have this great opportunity to invest in, hopefully we can find, and I think we did find 14 companies worthy of, that met our criteria and, we think were good investments, and we were able to do it at terms that were very favorable. We think they were fair, but favorable versus other jurisdictions. And I think that gives our fund a greater likelihood of being financially successful.
So that's a good segue. I think there's a common perspective among Atlantic Canada that there's not enough private investment money available. Do you think that's true, or are there not enough startups for the money that's currently available?
Well, it's a complicated answer, but let me start the complicated answer by making a very strong statement that a lot of people wouldn't like hearing me say. The good companies get money. So from simplistically, that suggests that there is enough money. I think the ones that aren't getting money are lesser quality opportunities, and maybe they shouldn't get money. that comment would piss off a lot of people. I recognize that, but I think that's generally, that's at least the number of companies in which we haven't invested in that we wish we had is not very large.
Right. Now, is that qualified? Like, is there a qualification that goes with that says the good companies get money, but sometimes they have to go elsewhere to do so?
So now let me get into the complicated. I see that the startup financing system in Atlantic Canada, let's call it has 4 stages. And then I'll make a comment about how much capital is at every stage. Because I think there is a dearth of capital at a very important stage. So stage 1 is you've got an idea, you need a few $1,000, $50, $100,000 to be able to at least work on that idea, build a prototype and do initial market assessments and get in contact with, including getting in contact with the customer, some level of customer group that allows you to start discovering the market and start working on product market fit. That money comes often from angels. There are some government programs that help, but it's a stage that really relies on angel investing. There's not enough capital in Atlantic Canada at that stage. We would really benefit from more money at that stage, getting more companies at least off the ground. The second stage for those companies that do successfully build a prototype and get some early customer traction would be to go to, and this is where the government is often directly involved across the 4 provinces. In Nova Scotia, the entity would be called a Novacor. You go and you hope to raise a couple $100,000, $200,000-$300,000 from a Novacor. There's some other government programs through a COA and IRAP that could often get that money up to $500,000. That money has historically not been hard to get. There's been quite a bit of money at that stage and has been that hard to get. With that money, hopefully you get beyond a prototype to a minimum viable product, or even maybe a second version of a product. You've started to commercialize. You may not have a ton of customers, but you've got true commercial customers paying for the product in a commercial manner, using it as it's intended to be used. That's when Build Ventures, and we're the only player at this point. And my opinion is that there's been enough capital so far, based on our assessment of, there's not a lot of companies out there that we wish we had invested in. But that's when we come in and we write, we often invest somewhere between $1 and $3 million to help that company take it to the next step, start really hiring the people they need to start to grow the company and see the kind of growth that at the 4th stage, your location is no longer an issue. A venture capitalist not from Atlantic Canada will take note of a fast-growing company no matter where it is, and that's where your money really is probably going to come from outside the region. And if you don't get to that phase, and you can't get the attention of an outside venture capitalist at that stage, there might be something fundamentally wrong with the company anyways.
Right.
And that's that hidden undertone of when you hear the criticism that there's not enough money in the system. The second question that's not being asked is, well, is there not enough money in the system, or is that company just not backable?
Right.
And I'm not, again, I can't, there are definitely, I'm sure there's definitely examples out there of companies that are backable that aren't finding the money. But I don't think I don't think that's a large number of companies.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense.
So that's what Build has been able to do, and we've done it 5 times in our portfolios, get these companies. And again, I'm not trying to claim that we did it. We're part of, the management team is the most important part. We're just an enabler, financial enabler. They get to a point where suddenly, their rounds are being led by outsiders who are thrilled to have an opportunity to dump millions of dollars into a Atlantic Canadian based company.
Right.
Because of the true progress of that business.
Now, circling back to something you mentioned earlier, which was government funding not always being able to say no. In Canada, compared to the US, one of the criticisms that's leveled a lot is even government-backed funds aren't the same as having totally private money. Do you see any disadvantages to having government-backed private funds like Build Ventures versus a completely private fund?
Yes. We've mitigated a lot of it through our limited partnership agreement. Our limited partnership agreement, which directs the investment activities and gives Patrick and I the independence we need to be able to do the right things. is we've got a really strong agreement that allows us to act very much like a private sector fund, but that's not the case in all. And to the extent that there is a motivation to be an economic development vehicle versus a venture fund, that may occur if you've got government money, then I'd see that as a negative for sure. The other negative is if you're doing a really good job as a venture capitalist and you've got a bunch of private sector investors, pretty confidently that not only are they going to keep investing in your subsequent funds, but they're probably going to bring people along with them.
Right.
It's rational behavior. That just, unfortunately, governments change. There's new governments, there's new people on your file, you just don't have that same automatic. I'm not saying that it's automatic necessarily, but you can see that you just
not necessarily completely rational.
Not completely rational. So it's, a perfectly good fund may die just because they don't get, their investors don't support them because of factors that are beyond their control. Like there's a new government. The conservative government, this was an initiative of the conservative government, the liberal government's not going to do it, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
That's the other negative.
Presumably that was something you were cognizant of when you wrote those LP agreements going in, that, we need to set the boundaries here to make sure that we don't face these issues.
But nonetheless, we did the best we could, but we can't protect ourselves entirely.
Right.
But what Patrick and I did to help ourselves is we were very thoughtful around the kind of organization we're going to build. And we made sure that we were able to be nimble, that we were able to survive long periods of time of not having capital to invest, that we were able to, theoretically go after different pools of capital and all the kind of stuff that I think, we haven't had to do yet, but we are much more likely. And basically it comes down to not feeding a big overhead. So we don't have this big organization that we have to feed. It's really just him and I.
Which you can view as another hedge.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I want to be respectful of your time. We'll maybe get it deeper into specific startup investments in a follow-up or something. But as a more general question, what advice would you have for startup founders in Atlantic Canada looking to raise investment, and or what advice should they ignore?
The advice that I would have for them to raise investments is twofold. I know I didn't come up with three, but three very important ones. Firstly, try and get as far as you can without raising money. Just progress as much as you can before you have to raise money. Always try to get more true company progress before you're out asking for money. And then secondly, always raise as much as you can, and make sure you run a business that has that ability to withstand the potentially long periods of time that it may take you to both progress your company and raise the next round. Be very, very, very careful to make sure that you can withstand as many unforeseeable issues that can happen that are both inside and outside your control as you possibly can. That's one thing I've continued to tell people. It's just like, wait as long as you can. There's a real sense in venture investing or in startup world that you have to go as fast as you can. I'm not necessarily sure that's actually the right approach. You got to make progress. You got to execute. You got to get shit done. But raising money just to be able to sprinkle fuel on the fire, especially if you're not ready to, is just going to kill you. It's very damaging. And the longer you can wait, the better.
And has that always been your view for both of those points, or has that been exacerbated by, well, not just a perceived, but a proven reduction in early seed investments in the last few years?
Yeah, so I didn't have a view 5 years ago, and I've developed that view over the last 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And it's not, and believe me, that's not a blank. That's a generality. That wouldn't apply to everybody, but in general, founders should get as much done as they can before they go out and raise money. And when they do raise money, really, really make sure that you have a lot of margin of safety in your finances by both raising a lot, as much as you can, and being very careful with how you spend it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it sounds like it fits with the value-based company development and investment thesis that you've held on to for a long time, but it's certainly become, that sentiment, I think, has become more prevalent because of a tightening in the seed investment market over the last few years. So I was just curious whether that was something you'd long held or had been exacerbated, because you tend to hear it more now, I think.
Yeah, so that's not why I said it, but yeah, I do acknowledge what you said, and I have heard that. One thing that struck, one thing that I keep getting baffled by, there's a bad habit, and I'm not, again, this is going to be a criticism, but I think this is, I'm still not sure why this happens, whether how avoidable it is. But, you make an investment and you have a financial plan on which you're investing, and you think a company this round's going to, get them at least 24 months. And it always blows me away how quickly the first, you think, it's going to get them 24 months, but maybe they've got 6 months extra margin of safety in the plan just in case things don't go according to plan. Mm-hmm. I'm constantly baffled at how quickly we lose those 6 months. Those 6 months evaporate so frequently, so quickly. And that's why I'm saying, like, you got a company that went and built an organization that suddenly had to be fed, and yet the business progress isn't matching, the organization. These companies can get themselves into trouble very quickly.
Some sort of manifestation of Parkinson's law in company building, I guess. I don't know if you're familiar with Parkinson's law, but basically says a task will swell to the time allotted to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The money will get spent according to the time allotted to it.
Yeah.
All right, a couple quick ones here to finish up, and then I'll let you go. I've kept you for a while here. What's one of your favorite sailing events you've ever participated in?
Favorite sailing event I ever participated was the 1992 J24 Nationals in Kingston. I got to sail with John Roy, who passed away last summer. It blew, which was great for us. Sailing with those guys was so much fun, and sailing with Leroy in particular, that guy was such a grinder. And that guy was so optimistic, and we could have a terrible start. We could be mid-fleet, and there was never a doubt in that guy's mind that he wasn't going to catch most of the boats ahead of him, and he did it. And he consistently did it.
Was one did one motivate the other, or was it? Do you think it was his eternal optimism that generated his results, or his results that generated the eternal optimism?
It was a virtuous circle, man. They both
built on each other.
Built on each other for sure. But yeah, it was, and I learned a lot from that experience about that. I mean, I think from that experience, I've also had a similar outlook in sailing. And at the recent sonar, I'm going to compliment my crew, but again, it's going to be a backhanded insult. We just sailed in the Sonar Worlds, which was a great regatta. Unfortunately, the conditions weren't phenomenal. And we had some serious challenges based on, being in a big fleet for the first time in a long time, and some of the things that can happen that, you just can't get ready for when you're, often sailing in 10 boat fleets and suddenly you're in a 25 boat fleet. But, we got ourselves into trouble a lot. And I think we passed more boats that regatta than any other boat. Well, again, compliment that we were so fast, we were able to pass boats, but we also put ourselves in that position that we had to pass so many boats because we were often in so much trouble. And I think a lot of that, whenever we get into trouble, we have this optimism and this, why it's irrational not to have the optimism. I mean, why are you out there?
Right.
You have a bad start. Were you going to sit there and mope and accept the fact that you're going to be deep? No, you might as well go out and try and pass as many boats as you can. And we were able to do it. It was great. It was fun. But as I said, unfortunately, it was getting a little tiring after we kept putting ourselves in these positions that we had to pass so many boats.
Yeah, fair enough. What's 1 to 3 books you've gifted often or that have had a big impact on you? And I know you briefly mentioned there was a couple management books earlier too.
Well, so let me start with the management book. One book that has had a massive impact on me is a book by Daniel Pink called Drive. And that's around motivating and understanding the motivation of high performance people. Great book. Fantastic book. Resonated with me very, very strongly. And I use the, a lot of that stuff I think I understood intrinsically based on my own behaviors, but it put it in a framework that I've been able to use to both, to explain a lot of this stuff to people. So Drive. On investing, I don't know which book you want to read on Warren Buffett, but I find the books on Warren Buffett are really important books to read if you want to be a good investor and you appreciate value investing. But there's also some great life lessons in books on Warren Buffett. I mean, the Snowball, which is the very large book that was written by Alice Schroeder, is probably a good one. And a third book, man, like what are the 3 books that? A book that's fantastic on a topic that we've talked about is a book by a guy named Michael Mauboussin, who studies complex systems and in particular applies what he studied to the world of investing. And this one helps you understand the role of skill and luck in outcomes. And it is called, what is that one called again? I'm trying to remember the name of that book.
I'm sure we can look it up.
The Success Equation, Untangling Skill and Luck.
Okay.
In business, sports, and investing.
There you go.
So it doesn't just stick to investing. So yeah, there's three quick books that I could think of, but there's lots of others. I'm also very passionate about behavioral investing and the psychology of investing. Lots of great books on that. That's an important area for people to understand, for sure.
Cool. Okay, one last question. What advice would you give to a smart, driven college student about to enter the real world, and what advice should they ignore?
So can I assume that
your master's in economics?
No, don't do that. Assuming they're going into business and they're interested in business, my advice to them would be to seek out companies known for having really, really good cultures and just work for them. And don't worry about where you're going, what your position is as much, where your next promotions can come from. Expose yourself to really good business cultures.
And what do you mean by culture? How do you define culture?
Well, culture to me is sort of congruent, often has a congruent set of objectives and values in which a company, a group of people collectively engage and execute on. At Build Ventures, ours, Patrick and I only spend all day trying to invest in and help build great companies. And everything we do is consistent with that. All of our decisions are around helping build great companies because we know and we're very comfortable that the outcomes will benefit us as well. So we spend less time thinking about our own particular, position in a company or how much of it we own. We certainly have to think about that stuff when we make an investment, but day to day, it's all about helping build great companies. There's other, at Burgundy, our culture was very much around investment excellence and taking care of clients and making sure that whatever we did was just do the right thing for the client. Again, knowing that if we did those two things well, we'd all get taken care of in the end.
Right.
I think good cultures attract good people, and it sort of feeds on itself. And if you're a young person, you can get exposed to that early. That'll help. I think that'll help you tremendously, guiding you in the future.
How do you screen for that ahead of time?
I think talking to other. I think you just. I think the best thing to do is to talk to people that know the company or work at the company, and just understand again what motivates them, why they do things, what they like about it. Do they feel empowered and they feel like they can do what's right at all times, or do they feel pressures to do things that sometimes makes them uncomfortable? All that kind of stuff. It's just at the end of the day, if it sounds like it's a good environment and a strong focused company culture,
I think that'll come out a lot in terms of as you talk to people.
Perfect. Okay. What's the best way for people to reach you or Build Ventures and the companies you're supporting?
Well, go to our website, buildventures.ca. You can both find my contact information there and you can see our portfolio. That's probably the best way.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks so much, Rob. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for taking the time.
That was enjoyable. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Just a reminder, you can find show notes, links to everything we talked about, and more at grahammann.net/podcast. And I would encourage you to sign up for my weekly email list to make sure you get notified about new blog posts and podcasts. See you next time.